Hello, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Kristen McMahon, and I have the privilege of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. Today, we are excited to bring you Lynne Olson as our speaker for the Al and Marge Brown Lecture on World War II. The Al and Marge Brown Lecture on World War II was established in 2018 through the generosity of Phil and Marianne Zimmer. And this program is also made possible in part by the Robert H. Jackson Endowment Fund, the Salute to the Greatest Generation Fund, and the Glenn W. Snow / World War II Legacy Fund. So thank you to all those who have enabled us to do this. Before I officially introduce Lynne and my co-conversationalist, Greg Peterson, a few housekeeping notes. Automated captions are enabled, so if you need those, please turn on that feature to enhance your experience. There will be a question and answer portion at the end of our conversation with Lynne, but you do not need to wait until the end to ask your questions. Please put those in the Q&A section as you think of them, and we will address them. And if you have a question but are not able to type it, please just raise your hand during the Q&A portion instead. And thank you to Greg Peterson of counsel with Phillips Lytle Law Firm and one of the co-founders of the Jackson Center for joining me for this conversation today. And now to officially welcome our guest, Lynne Olson. Lynne is a New York Times bestselling author of 9 books of history, most of which deal with World War II, and former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright has called her our era's foremost chronicler of World War II politics and diplomacy. Her impressive list of books includes 3 New York Times bestsellers, Madame Foucault's Secret War, the daring young woman who led France's largest spy network against the Nazi, Those Angry Days, Roosevelt, Lindbergh, and America's Fight Over World War II from 1939 to 1941, and Citizens of London, the Americans who stood with Britain in its darkest, finest hour. And our conversation today is going to focus on these last 2 books, Those Angry Days and Citizens of London, but we'll range a little bit through history as well. Born in Hawaii, Lynne graduated magna cum laude from the University of Arizona. Before becoming a full-time author, she worked as a journalist for 10 years, first with the Associated Press as a national feature writer in New York, a foreign correspondent in AP's Moscow bureau, and as a political reporter in Washington. She left the AP to join the Washington bureau of the Baltimore Sun, where she covered national politics and eventually the White House. Lynne lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband, Stanley Cloud, with whom she has co-authored 2 books. Lynne, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to it.
So I wanted to start with a level setting question, and because I am always curious where authors get their ideas for what they're writing about. Could you talk to us a little bit about, especially for Citizens of London and Those Angry Days, what was the germ for both of those books?
Well, I should start at the beginning. You know, as you mentioned, I started out as a journalist. I had absolutely no idea that I was going to become a historian. And I got tired of daily deadlines as a journalist. So I switched to book writing. And basically, they all came out of, in one way or another, of the first book that my husband and I wrote together called The Murrow Boys, which was about Edward R. Murrow, the great CBS journalist, and the correspondents he hired to create CBS News before and during World War II. And the key is World War II. Murrow made his name principally in London during the war. He became really America's most influential foreign correspondent. And he did it in London. He was assigned to London throughout the war. And so we did a lot of research in London about, during that period. And I just fell in love with the time and the place. It was, you know, it was the most dramatic kind of event that particular 1940, when London stood alone against Hitler after the rest of Europe had fallen to the Nazis, was the period that we wrote about most. And it I knew somewhat about it. I didn't major in history, but I'm a real Anglophile, and so I knew a lot of quite a bit about it. But I really delved into how did this happen? How did this tiny little country end up, fending off the greatest military power in the world? On the same day that the Germans launched their blitzkrieg of Western Europe, that was the same day that Winston Churchill became prime minister. And if it hadn't been for Winston Churchill, in my opinion, the Brits probably would have gone down to defeat. So, it was just this astonishing confluence of dramatic events in this one place. And so that really intrigued me. And that writing that book, writing The Murrow Boys, led to pretty much the books that followed. So in other words, almost all my books have dealt with World War II, as you said, and especially in my early career as a historian, most of them dealt with England during that time in some way. So that's how it began. And in terms of Citizens of London and Those Angry Days, Citizens of London, I wanted to tell the story of the Anglo-American alliance from the side of America, from the side of 3 Americans who were in London during the war and who played a really big role in first creating that alliance and then keeping it going. And that's so it's basically from the British point of view, but it's about how the British and the Americans came together. My next book, Those Angry Days, is the flip side of that. It's set in the United States, particularly during the years 1939 to 1941, when America was really trying to decide what role it was going to have, what role it was going to play in the war. And it was an extremely contentious time in this country, very much like now. There was in 1939, basically most of America, the United States, was isolationists. They didn't want to have anything to do with the war. They didn't really want to go to help Britain fend off Germans. And so Those Angry Days is basically about that battle, what went on to basically change America's mind about the importance of helping Britain, and in the end, the importance of getting into the war.
Can I ask a question
Sure.
regarding the genesis of this? What drives you? Does the individual drive the story here, World War II, or does World War II drive the individual?
Oh, that's a really good question, Greg. For me, it was the individual. For Citizens of London, first of all, again, I didn't deliberately set out to do any of this. I did not, okay, I'm going to write, this is going to be the progress of my book writing career. That is not at all the case. But I realized that I need to have really interesting characters. If I'm going to write a book, they have to be interesting and they have to be important. And I also realized that the people I choose tend to be unsung heroes, people that a lot of readers, Americans, don't know anything about. So in the case of Citizens of London, I was struck initially by one individual. I said it's really about 3 Americans in London, and one of them is John Gilbert Wynant, who was the American ambassador to London during the war. And I found out about him when I was doing research for a book before, the book I had written before, and I didn't know anything about him. I had never heard of him. And I thought, my God, that's incredible. He replaced Joseph Kennedy as ambassador. And then the more I found, the more research I did about him, the more I realized how important he had been. Perhaps the most important American in the UK during that time, with the exception of Dwight Eisenhower. So I came across him, and then I thought about how can I build this story? Publishers generally don't like to publish books about people that nobody knows about, and nobody knew about him. So it came to me gradually. The framework would be that I would add two other Americans, Edward R. Murrow, who I had already written about, and Averell Harriman, who is also very, very important. But make it the framework being the creation of this alliance and how it happened and what the role these people played, these men played. But going back to your question, it's the individual usually. There is an individual that I come across. Then the story is not, it's not just about that individual, it's about what he or she was involved with, but it's usually the personal before the big picture.
Well, speaking of personal, if I could be personal, my introduction to Lynne Olson came through a wedding of the great granddaughter of Ambassador Winant. I was invited and I sat next to the grandson of Ambassador Winant, John, and he was telling me about your book, and he knew about the Jackson Center, and that kind of led to me learning about somebody I really did not know about. And so I was curious because I've seen you talk about Ambassador Winant, and I know on the listening line are Winants. If perhaps you could, as you talk about Citizen of London, about maybe he's the hero of the book. And maybe could you expand a little bit more before we kind of go down other avenues?
Sure. As I said, he was unknown, and that's what really intrigued me to begin with. I had no idea how important he was. I had no idea about his extraordinary career. John Winant, he went by Gil. Gil Winant had been the governor of New Hampshire at the same time that Franklin Roosevelt was governor of New York, and Gil Winant was a Republican. Obviously, FDR was a Democrat, but they saw eye to eye. Gil Winant was a very unusual Republican because he was very interested in social and economic justice and always had been. He started his career as he came from a fairly well-to-do family. He went to St. Paul's School in New Hampshire, fell in love with the place, became a teacher there. Went off to World War I and became a pilot. And then he started his political career as the most untypical politician you can imagine. He was a terrible speaker. He was a very shy, retiring person who was passionate about a lot of things. And so the idea that this very unpolitician-like person would become the governor of New Hampshire and then become one of the, together with Franklin Roosevelt, they were the two most progressive governors, I think, in the country. And he became a very big ally of Roosevelt when Roosevelt reached the White House. Roosevelt made him the first head of Social Security. The thing about Gil Winant that really impressed me right from the beginning is the moral courage he had. His idealism impressed me. The idea that we had to. We couldn't focus on the rich. We had to help the poor, and that was true all the way through his life. But the moral courage he showed over and over and over again when it was clear that his political career was challenged. Many times he chose the ethical way, the courageous way. And just one very quick example: as head of the Social Security, the Republicans in 1940, it had passed in 1937, 36. The Republicans tried to kill it, and Gil Winant basically renounced his own party and undertook a speaking campaign in favor of Social Security. So he basically forfeited his political future as a Republican because of his standing up for Social Security and other social justice issues. So that intrigued me right from the start. And then this very shy, unassuming, very bad speaker is made ambassador to the UK in the worst time of Britain's history. He goes over there after Joseph Kennedy, not exactly a hard act to follow, but he was brilliant in how he convinced the Brits that we were on their side. You know, we were isolationists. We were not in the war. We had showed no signs of getting into the war, but he managed to persuade them that America is going to come to your rescue, and he showed that over and over. He became the most beloved American, certainly at that time. There's no question, and he was just so incredibly important in weaving this team together that finally became the special relationship, this alliance. And so he is the hero of the book. I set out. I mean, it's not crystal clear in the book. I mean, I talk about, you know, all three of them, but he really is the one that I was, you know, shaping the book around.
Speaking of moral courage, I was struck by, in those angry days, the behavior of Wendell Willkie as a political candidate, for and even post his political candidacy. And so I would love for you to elaborate some on that he really seemed, but for perhaps a little blip as the election was very close, really seemed to put country ahead of anything else, including his own electoral success.
Right.
And then afterwards, with his work to repeal the Neutrality Act and his work on, and I'm thinking specifically, I guess, while he was a candidate, of his work on getting the Selective Service Act approved,
Right.
which basically took it out of political contention.
Right.
Could you talk a little bit
Sure.
about that as well?
Sure. Yeah. No, I think, you know, if there's any hero in those angry days, it's Wendell Willkie. You know, Wendell Willkie was this dark horse candidate in 1940, Republican candidate for the Republican nomination. And nobody expected him to win. I mean, he had no background in politics. In fact, he had been a Democrat until, you know, a year or two before. But he had behind him a base of I mean, Republicans who were conservative in terms of economic, financial issues, but were very progressive especially in terms of international issues. Back then, there was a real split in the Republican Party. There was a very, very big, well, very big, but a very influential wing of Republicans, mostly on the East Coast, who were very internationalist. You know, they had gone to school in Europe. They'd gone to school in England. They had traveled. They did business. You know, a lot of them were businessmen. They were lawyers. They cared very deeply about Europe and what was happening to it, and they believed that the U.S. had a major role in protecting, freedom abroad. So Willkie managed to attract a very large number of these people on the East Coast. Publishers like Henry Luce, who published Time and Life magazine, who's very, very important, but many others. And his shtick when he got into the race, we're talking about the spring and summer of 1940, which is when all this was going on in Europe, with the Blitzkrieg, the fall of France, Britain under siege from Germany, all that's going on. Willkie got into the race as a Republican, but instead of saying we have to stay out, we can't get involved, which the other Republican candidates were saying, he said, we have to help Britain. We have to make sure that Britain survives. It's essential for the United States to do that. So he was going against the leaders of his party totally, but in a very dramatic presidential convention, he won the nomination. So right away, we're talking in June 1940, FDR is running. FDR knows that his Republican opponent is supporting his foreign policy. He makes it clear, Wilkie makes it clear that we have to give aid to Britain. We have to do everything we can to prevent Germany from taking over all of Europe. If we have to have a draft, we're going to have a draft. This is in the middle of a presidential campaign, and he's a Republican. I mean, most Republicans didn't agree with this, or many Republicans didn't agree with this, but he over and over and over again in that campaign basically said, this is what this country needs. This is what the world needs. And he said specifically on a number of occasions, if it means I lose, I lose. Now, as you kind of alluded to, he kind of forgot that in the heat of the campaign toward the end of it, but he never stopped supporting, for example, a national draft, first peacetime draft in history, incredibly controversial. Nobody wanted it. Roosevelt wanted to stay far away from it, even though we needed it. You know, in order for us to eventually win the war, we had to have a military that was a military. I mean, our military was so incredibly weak at that point. And thanks to Wilkie's support of the draft, Franklin Roosevelt eventually got behind it, and it was passed. And as a result of the draft, we had an army that was not really ready by any means, but it was certainly more ready than it would have been if Wilkie hadn't been there. And it was the same, you know, in terms of virtually every other issue that came up in terms of the war throughout the campaign. And then obviously he did lose. But the very next day or 2 nights later, he went on the radio and said to the American people, basically, Franklin Roosevelt was elected. He is your president. He is my president. I will support him. And as you indicated, that was incredibly important. I mean, he supported Lend-Lease, the program to come to the aid of Britain. He supported virtually everything that Roosevelt was doing. And I don't know what would have happened if he hadn't. I mean, I think it would have been much more difficult for Roosevelt. And I'm not sure, you know, what ifs, I don't know, but certainly Wendell Willkie made it possible for this country to be as well prepared. And we weren't well prepared, but as well prepared as we were. He was a major figure in that. And I think the United States, I mean, the country really owed him a huge debt of gratitude. He did sacrifice his future. He did sacrifice his political career. There's no question. He was persona non grata in the Republican Party after the election. But he put country over party and over himself over and over and over again.
Lynn, a little, since we're doing this for the Robert H. Jackson Center, a little footnote for the benefit of Robert H. Jackson. During 1940, the issue became of the destroyer, you know, for basis conversation, and whether the president had the right to do that without getting the Congress involved. And it was Robert Jackson, as the Attorney General, who wrote the opinion, which ultimately led to Roosevelt proceeding ahead. And I know that Wendell Willkie backed that concept all the way. So it's just a little historical footnote for the benefit of our cause here.
Well, you know, actually, Kristen and I were talking about this a little bit ago. I did not know that much about Robert Jackson before I wrote Those Angry Days. I knew who he was. I knew about the Nuremberg trials. I knew he was on the Supreme Court. I didn't know anything, virtually anything about I knew that he had been Attorney General under Roosevelt, but I didn't know anything about his tenure. And to me, he comes in number two to, you know, if there's a hero in Those Angry Days, Robert Jackson is definitely there because of his steadfast championship of civil rights during that period when, you know, civil rights wasn't exactly what most people were thinking about in the run-up to the war, and even after, you know, the war began, including Franklin Roosevelt. You know, he had political enemies like Charles Lindbergh and others, isolationists. And he, some of his rhetoric was really inflammatory, but more than inflammatory. I mean, he accused them basically of being Nazis and fifth columnists, and it got really nasty. I mean, it's kind of, it resembles, later episodes in our history where people are portrayed as the other, and that they're anti-American, and Robert Jackson kept standing up for them again and again and again. Sometimes he didn't succeed, but I think his constant reminding other people in the administration of what this country stands for, I think was really, really important.
If I could, you mentioned Lindbergh. I'm
Mhm.
going to show you a card, which is an American First Committee contribution card, which ironically somebody sent to me just 3 days ago.
Oh my
Written
goodness. Oh my
card,
Lord.
and along with a letter on the America First. And I know you've talked about it, but I must tell you, we certainly know about Lindbergh, America's First. But as an organization, how it got started within
Yeah.
the colleges, some of the early members, I've heard you talk about it. It's kind of wow. It's sort of a who's who were members of the America's First in the late 30s when it got started. So I wonder if
Yeah,
you could chat a little about that a little bit.
sure. I mean, it's one of my favorite. I think it's probably one of, if not the favorite, it's not the favorite, but certainly one of the favorite parts of the book. Again, I didn't know this either when I first started doing research. First of all, I think people now think about, the fight between the isolationists and the interventionists, in kind of black and white terms now, as it turned, because of what happened, and the way the war turned out. So that the isolationists are bad, the interventionists are good. But at the time we're talking about the late 30s and certainly 1940, it wasn't clear what was going to happen. I mean, nobody knew about the Holocaust would happen, for example. So it's a whole thing of history while you're going through it. We're going through major upheavals in our history, and we don't know how it's all going to turn out. Well, certainly back then they didn't, and a lot of the isolationists were doing it for what they considered correct motives. And among one of the biggest groups who were anti-war back then, before we got into the war, were college students. They were young guys who were in their late teens, early 20s. Their fathers had been in World War I. The U.S. had been in World War I, and it was supposed to make the world safe for democracy. And instead, we get Hitler. I mean, so there was a lot of disillusion, anger at what happened in terms of the war, the feeling that the Brits took advantage of us, the Europeans took advantage of us. Look, we have Hitler now. And so there was a sense that we don't want to get into another European war. And the college students in general were really in the middle of this, because they knew that if we went to war again, they were going to be the ones on the front lines. It wasn't going to be, the middle-aged guys who were pushing it. It was going to be them. And so America First was originally created by a group of college students at Yale University. And what's so incredible is when you find out who they were. I mean, these were not conservative. I mean, I think a lot of people now think of America First as conservative businessmen, and that certainly was true later on. But these were not conservatives. These were actually quite progressive. You might even call them liberal. And I'll just tick off a few. I mean, there were about 6 or 7, guys. They all were at Yale. They were either graduate students or undergraduates. And one of them was Gerald Ford, who's going to be who's going to be president of the United States. Potter Stewart, who was going to be on the Supreme Court eventually, Sergeant Schreiber, who was going to be the first head of the Peace Corps, Kingman Brewster, who was going to be president of Yale one day, and ambassador to the UK. So these guys, they were college kids who just didn't want to have happen to them what happened earlier. And some of the supporters, again, really fast. One of the supporters was John F. Kennedy, who was a senior at Harvard. Kurt Vonnegut, what's his name? Gore Vidal. I mean, these are some of the movers and shakers, 20 years later in this country. But so they weren't doing it for nefarious reasons. They weren't anti-Semitic. They weren't, but they really were thinking of their country. They were thinking of themselves, but they're also thinking of their country. And I must add that virtually all of them got out of America. America first was set up at Yale, and then it moved to Chicago. And that's when it became kind of a haven of business people. And so most of these young guys got out, left it even before the war began, and virtually every single one of them either fought or they were on the front lines. Virtually every single one of them. But what it does, one of the things it does, it shows the complexities of when you look back at history and you say, oh, well, we should have known early on, but we didn't. And people do things for very different reasons, but I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's one of my favorite stories.
There's a lot of parallels that I see with conversations and politics today. In fact, in Those Angry Days, you quote, so I guess I should lay the groundwork by saying that the personal antipathy between President Roosevelt and Charles Lindbergh really set the tone for how this discussion played out publicly as well. And you quote a historian named Wayne Coyle by saying, individuals on both sides found it increasingly difficult to see their opponents as honest people who happened to hold different opinions. Attacks on both sides became more personal, vicious, and destructive, and it became easier to see one's adversaries not just as mistaken, but as evil, possibly motivated by selfish, anti-democratic, or even subversive considerations. And we have a lot of conversations about how almost nothing happening today is technically unprecedented, that there is something in history that parallels it or has a similar stance, or we've been through this before. Is there anything in your research that also helped understand, or can help us understand, how did we come out of that? You mentioned the othering before.
Yeah.
Is there guidance?
Again, it's so hard because we're going through this incredibly contentious, really awful time ourselves. And the one thing that I don't see is what we did see at that time, that yes, it was really, it was brutal, but there were people that were willing to, if not there were a few. And there were a few who stood up. And again, what we were talking about, the moral courage of a Wendell Willkie or a Robert Jackson, but who, especially Willkie, to tell the American people, we have to hang together. We have to do this. And and his reaching across. I don't think Wendell Willkie liked Roosevelt at all. I think he personally did not care for him at all. But he cooperated with him. After he was defeated, Roosevelt asked him to go to Europe and visit. I mean, he went all over the place, and he did, and that was very important. So he was ready to. He collaborated with Roosevelt, and I just don't see that now. Maybe it will happen. I don't know. It just, it's really hard to say, but it does, the more, the whole, I don't know, the last 6-7 years of our history in this country really does remind me a great deal of what went on in the 20s, and even before the 1930s, the 20s and 30s. It was a time of great upheaval, social upheaval, rapidly changing social mores, cultural mores. A lot of people very unhappy about that. A lot of people very unhappy about immigrants, refugees coming in. And it's so similar, and I just have no idea where we're going to end up.
Well, if you could predict that, you would be in a very different line of work. So
Yes, yes. I mean, and a lot of people do predict it, and then nobody knows. So,
Can I ask a question? Your Citizens of London, focuses on 3 individuals of note: Averil Harriman, Edward R. Murrow, and Ambassador Wynant. Is there any sense in your research that they actually collaborated among themselves? I mean, they're Americans for the cause of telling Roosevelt. In some case, the audience was Roosevelt. In Murrow's case, the audience was American citizenry, that Britain needs to be upheld. Do you get a sense that they talked among themselves?
well, yes. I mean, I think they did. I don't think, it was like a cabal that they were getting together and doing it together. They all had that same view, though. I mean, quite frankly, Murrow couldn't stand Harriman. Harriman couldn't stand Wynant. Wynant couldn't stand Harriman. So Murrow and Wynant were very close friends. They were very, very close. But they all had that same view, that it was essential that the U.S. get into the war, but also even before that happened, that the U.S. had to make sure that Britain did not go down to defeat, and they all, in their various ways, got that across to Roosevelt. But also, maybe even more important at that point, to the American people. I mean, that's where Murrow came in. Murrow, I think, was incredibly, he was critical. His reporting from London was critical in terms of getting the U.S., getting his listeners to realize what would happen if Britain went down. And his reporting also, when you were talking about the personal, what Murrow did so beautifully was to make the war and the bombing of London, for example, personal to Americans. It wasn't just, he didn't go on and say, all these bombs fell and St. Paul's managed to escape, but this building didn't. He talked about the individuals. He talked about being on the streets, and a particular what happened to a particular woman, or he followed anti-aircraft batteries around and talked to the people, and so he made it. He told the story through the people of London. And that had an enormous impact. He basically started reporting from London during the war in May. I mean, May 1940 is when the Germans launched their Blitzkrieg. And at that point, pretty much it was very heavily, most Americans did not want to go to the aid of Britain. They didn't want to help Britain at all. And by October, November, you're talking about the Blitz. When he's reporting from the Blitz, the Battle of Britain, it had gone from like 20% supporting aid to Britain to 58%, and it kept growing and growing and growing. And so he had an amazing impact on how American people thought about it, which made it easier then for Roosevelt. I mean, if the American people had begun changing their view, then it was easier for Roosevelt to do what he did. But so they each in their different way played a critical role in that.
A curiosity, and this is a what if, you know, December 7th, 1941, we get bombed at Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. Shortly thereafter, within the next few days, Germany declares war on America.
Right.
If Hitler had not done so, what do you think the dynamic would have been?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite what ifs. I mean, with all what ifs, it's impossible to know. I personally think that if Hitler had not declared war on us, that Roosevelt would have eventually, we would have eventually declared war, but it wouldn't have been then. I mean, I think Roosevelt obviously we had to go to war against Japan because Japan had attacked us. I think he had been pressed very hard by a lot of people before Pearl Harbor to actually get into the war against Germany. He refused. He absolutely refused. He was trying very hard not to get boots on the ground in Europe. And I suspect that he would have continued that kind of dilly-dallying afterwards, that all the resources initially would have gone to the fight against Japan and not against Germany. But I think there's no question we would have gotten into the war against Germany. The question is when, and would that have been too late for Britain? Because Britain at that point was in a two-front war. There's no question they were, fighting Germany, and now they were going to be fighting Japan. And so it was essential for Britain in terms of its survival to have us in that war as soon as possible against Germany. And once Roosevelt and once Hitler declared war, and then we declared war against Germany, then Roosevelt from that point on made it very clear, and to Churchill's great thanks, that the fight against Germany would take precedence over the fight against Japan, and that continued for quite some time.
As we get to opening it up to questions from our audience, I will actually start with a question that somebody asked me a couple of days ago to ask you. And this is from one of our local journalists and sports fans. His name is Russ Dietrich. And he wanted to know, in your research, did you come across times where it seemed like history had been rewritten, like they had prettied up something or made something seem more dire in order to either sort of correct an action or spur an action?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I probably could. Nothing stands out. Nothing. You mean like whether it was the government or whatever, prettying up something. One of what this is not quite, I don't think what he's asking, but that there was a lot of talk, or has been for ever since it happened, that we knew something about Pearl Harbor. That Roosevelt and Churchill, but Roosevelt and Churchill knew that the Japanese were going to bomb Pearl Harbor and didn't do anything about it. And from everything that I can, and I'm certainly not an expert on Pearl Harbor, but I've done a lot of research about that, about both of them in that period, is that no, they both knew that the Japanese were on the march, so to speak, on marching on water. That the fleet had sailed. Their intelligence was not obviously failed both countries, but they did not know where the fleet was going. And they suspected it was going to be the Philippines, etc. And nobody had any idea. And I truly believe that they did not know that it was going to be Pearl Harbor.
A reminder to put your questions into the Q&A section so I can feed those. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the Century Group. That was a new concept for me as well, and sort of their underpinnings and their I don't really want to say scheming, but they were sort of behind the scenes people.
Yeah.
Of influence.
Yeah. It's some of the same people that I was talking about when I was talking about the people who were supporting Wendell Willkie. The Century Group was a group, it was basically a pressure group. It was a group of very prominent, for the most part, they weren't all Republicans, but many of them were Republican, very prominent Republican people on the East Coast, publishers, Wall Street people, people, movers and shakers in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, but mostly New York, who decided that Roosevelt was being too he wasn't really responding to what was going on, that he needed to do more to help Britain. And then he needed, basically, the Century Group believed we needed to get into the war. And so behind the scenes, they were pulling strings. And they included, as I said, people like Henry Luce. And if you're the publisher of the two most prominent, most influential magazines in the country, you have a lot of clout. And Henry Luce did. And he was a member of the Century Group, publishers of several New York newspapers, as I said, Wall Street people, and so they were really pushing Roosevelt very, very hard to, as I said, get into the war, to give aid to Britain. And I think. And some of their tactics were not great. I mean, and they were really nasty, but they were very, very effective. I think they really helped push Roosevelt along. And the reason why they're called the Century Group, most of them, or many of them, belong to the Century Association, which is still going on. It's in New York. It has a wonderful, I've been in there. My husband is a member of a club that has privileges with the Century Club. It's a group of, of intellectuals, journalists. It's basically the A-list of New York, intellectual A-list of New York, and it's still very much a power. But that's where they met. That's where they met, and so that's why they got that name.
Gotcha. Link, if I could ask a question about Averell Harriman, we've sort of bypassed him completely. I get a sense that he was not your favorite guy.
You did, huh? No, he wasn't. I mean, I think Averell Harriman, I don't like him personally, but I think he was really, really important. Averell Harriman is a fascinating case. He wanted to be, part of FDR's in-group, and FDR knew Averell Harriman, knew his father. They came from similar backgrounds, New York, Hudson Valley backgrounds. And he didn't like Averell Harriman. And so he wasn't going to let him be part of his in-group, and sent him to London to be head of the Lend-Lease program there. And so Averell Harriman then decided, okay, he was going to be part of Churchill's in-group, which he did become. And basically was always trying to one up and cut out Gil Wynant. So for all that, I didn't like him personally, but he was very, very important. He really worked extremely hard to get American aid to Britain, and he played a very important role as a go-between between Roosevelt and Churchill. So, even though he was not my favorite character, he definitely was very, very influential in keeping that alliance going.
We have a question from Mark about Ambassador Wynant and his deep heroics, his heroism in flying fighter missions and volunteering for dangerous missions, but that clearly the war must have taken a toll on him, and his suicide. Mark wondered if there was anything in your research that sort of helped reconcile some of these seemingly disparate parts of Ambassador Wynant.
Well, I think Gil Wynant, he was a very complicated guy. All three of these guys. Well, Murrow was a complicated guy. I don't know if Harriman was complicated, but certainly Wynant and Murrow were. Wynant was he was a depressive, I think, to begin with. He was also an incredible workaholic. And he, like many people during the war, and I make that point in Citizens of London, basically they were working all the time. The stress that they were under, whether they were Roosevelt, I mean, whether they were Eisenhower, whether they were Wynant, whether they were whoever, they were under so much stress, all that they were working 24 hours a day. And when the war was over, I think it was incredibly difficult for many of them, if not most of them. He was an idealist. He had hoped that the war would make the world safe for democracy again, that there would be economic justice. I mean, that was the whole point, is to get rid of Hitler, to get rid of the the dictators, and to bring back democracy. And he saw what was happening, the Cold War. The world was not doing that. He was also Roosevelt's guy. He had hoped for another important job in the Roosevelt administration, and then Roosevelt dies in April 1945. He was not Truman's guy. And also he fell in love with one of Winston Churchill's daughters, and they had an affair, Sarah Churchill. And he wanted very much to marry her. He was married. He was more or less separated from his wife, but he was still married, and she had been married, and I think she deeply cared about him. She deeply loved him, I think, but she was much younger, and she didn't want that after the war. So all of this, I think, it was too much for him. He went home. He stayed in London until 1946. Until after the war, and then went home to New Hampshire. And I just think that it was all I think his world was over. I mean, he saw his world as having fallen apart. And so, yes, he killed himself. And it was such a shock, I think, for everybody that knew him. The man was incredibly beloved by so many people, by Brits, by Americans, and that, that he had given his heart and soul to the effort to bring justice to the world and freedom, and then he couldn't survive. And I'm going to get this wrong. I can't remember the exact quote, but this Manchester Guardian, British newspaper, said there's something to be said about how awful this world if a man like John Gilbert Wynant couldn't bear to live in it. And so he had a dramatic impact on so many people, and the idea that he couldn't save himself was deeply, deeply upsetting to many people. And that's one reason I wrote the book, is because nobody knew about him, and I just thought that this is wrong. I mean, he had done so much in so many ways for not just the big cause, but for individual people. I mean, Citizens of London is filled with anecdotes about his helping various people, and I just thought, it's wrong that people don't know about him, and I think people do know about him, or certainly they know a lot more about him since that book came out.
Lynne, as we're getting towards wrapping up, what's the question you expected from Kristen or me today that we haven't addressed?
You guys have been so incredibly good. I can't think of any. I can't. No, I think we've done a really good job of covering certainly those two. I mean, in terms of one reason I think that I write about the past is that I get great comfort out of it. It's a time that has is over. And you can see how, it developed, and you could see how people were thinking nothing good is going to happen. It's all going to be awful. And then I tend to choose subjects that it actually does work out. And I mean, it's not 100%, nothing ever is, but that what people were looking for actually did happen. They managed to make things happen. So I'm still doing that. I'm still choosing subjects where people, whether they're important or not, people can change history. I mean, people can make a difference in history. I mean, sometimes they're ambassadors, sometimes they're journalists, and sometimes they're just regular people. They're people in the French Resistance who decide, okay, we are not going to have the Germans rule our country. And it has happened over and over and over again. And I just hope that happens here too.
We just got in a couple of questions about your writing process. I'm going to paraphrase the two of them together before we. So Phil asks, how did you come to write by what he calls the PhD approach, which is personalize, humanize, and dramatize? Do you think this is your journalistic background or something else that drives you? And the second question is, how do you go about writing about someone? How does that start?
The first question, he's right. Yeah, I think my journalistic background has played a huge role in how I write. As a journalist, especially if you work for a wire service or a newspaper or whatever, and one of the things you learn immediately is that you have to hook your reader immediately. I mean, you've got to pull them in. You can't start and drone on and on and on. You have to pull them in. And so that's always been in the back of my mind. I was a feature writer for a couple of years. And so, I'm always thinking about how to write it so that people will be interested in reading it. And also that making the books be around people. In other words, so the people they're in the foreground. Of course I write about events, and of course I write about, bigger issues, but it's all people are in the middle. They're in the front. They're always there. I don't go off into pages and pages of talking about the background. So that's basically how I said it. Both my husband wrote for Time magazine, and Time magazine did this a lot. They personalized their stories. And we both set out to write nonfiction as if it were a novel, using novelistic techniques, everything real, everything based on fact, but using to draw people in and to keep them in. And that's what I try to do in every book. In terms of the other question about how I do it, I don't know. I mean, I think that I could talk about that for another hour.
Well, just have to have you back on that then.
Okay.
Right. So I also want to let our audience know that I started your most recent book, Empress of the Nile, the daredevil archaeologist who saved Egypt's ancient temples from destruction, which was just published this past February. It's a fascinating story, but I had to put it aside to finish these two for our conversation today. But I want to thank you, Greg and Lynne, for joining us for this conversation for our Al and Marge Brown lecture on World War II. We hope that we have provided our audience with some food for thought and some new reading material. And the Al and Marge Brown Lecture on World War II was established in 2018 and is supported by generous donors to the Jackson Center. And if you are interested in supporting the center or any of our programs, please go to www.roberthjackson.org/donate. And you can access any of our programs on our YouTube channel. While you're there, please subscribe. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And Lynne and Greg, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Lynne.
Take care.